December 1944. The Smolensk region was buried in snow. Heavy snowdrifts pressed on the roofs of old barracks near the railway station. Silence hung in the frosty air, broken only by the occasional shouts of the attendants and the booming noise of an approaching train. NKVD Captain Alexei Vorontsov stood on the platform, lighting a cigarette and wrapping himself in his greatcoat, although he was not afraid of the cold. The wind tore the snow off the roof, piercing through, but he didn't even blink. Two operatives stood behind him, silent, with the faces of people who no longer cared who they were taking or where they were going. But Vorontsov was not like that. He wasn't used to following orders without thinking, and this order was especially strange. He already knew what kind of train was coming, but the longer he waited, the more he felt some kind of incomprehensible anxiety. The secrecy of the order was alarming. The documents did not contain the usual notes about nationality, origin, or membership in military groups. There were 15 names on the list, ages 7 to 12, and a short note. The category is special, delivered to the point Object 17. He had seen a lot of covert operations, but usually such orders concerned either high-ranking defectors or particularly dangerous criminals. Children? It was something new. The train arrived late, heavy, creaking, similar to those used to transport prisoners. The black carriages seemed to absorb the light. There were no glass in their windows, only metal shutters. When the doors opened, there was a smell of frosty dampness and mold, and a sergeant in a shabby uniform appeared in the passage. His face was gray, haggard, and there were black circles under his eyes. "The cargo has arrived, Comrade Captain." His voice sounded hoarse, as if he hadn't slept in days. Vorontsov did not even turn to him, but continued to stare into the darkness of the carriage. "Check it out," he said shortly, and one of the operatives stepped forward, climbing into the carriage. It was quiet for a minute. Then a voice. "Everything is in place. Alive." The captain slowly turned his gaze to the sergeant, noticing that he was nervously twisting his gloves in his hands. "Who was responsible for the escort?" "There were 6 of us, Comrade Captain." The sergeant wiped his forehead with his sleeve, hesitated, lowered his eyes. "There are 3 left." Vorontsov frowned. "Losses?" The sergeant swallowed, coughed, and looked away. "1 is missing. I went to the bathroom at night and never came back. 2 of them shot themselves." Vorontsov did not immediately respond, but stared at him intently, trying to assess whether he was lying, not telling the truth, or just scared. "Shot yourself?" "Yes, Comrade Captain. 1 at night, the other in the morning. No notes, no tantrums. They just took a gun and—" He moved his hand briefly to his temple, as if imitating a shot. "Have you reported?" The sergeant shook his head, then hesitated again. "We didn't know how to explain it. They didn't complain. They didn't show any anxiety. We were just watching." "Who was watching?" "Children." Vorontsov felt an icy lump spread in his chest. "Were they doing something?" "No. We just sat and watched." The captain stepped closer to the carriage and looked inside. There were children sitting on rough bunks. They didn't cry. They didn't scream. They didn't even move. 15 pairs of eyes stared straight at him, as if he were something unnecessary and empty for them. But one of them was different. A thin boy with pale skin was sitting in the corner. Vorontsov immediately noticed him. The rest looked at least somehow. Some pressed their hands to their chests, some pressed their knees. This one was sitting perfectly still, like a mannequin. He didn't even blink. The captain looked into his eyes. There was no emotion in them. There was no life. Only emptiness. Something in Vorontsov's stomach twisted into a painful knot. It was the same feeling he had once experienced when, at night, while in counterintelligence, he entered a room with a traitor. Then he was almost stabbed, and since then he has learned to sense danger before it manifests itself. He felt something similar now, but even worse. The boy did not look away, and suddenly he smiled, briefly, almost imperceptibly, but the captain noticed it. The journey took 12 hours. They were driving through snow-covered forests, hidden from prying eyes. Trucks were slowly making their way through the snowdrifts. The road was empty. There was not a single settlement, just a white void. Vorontsov sat in the cab, silently watching the road, until his gaze sometimes returned to the gap in the tarpaulin through which he could see part of the body. The children were still sitting motionless. On the 3rd hour of the journey, the driver complained of a headache. In the 5th hour, one of the soldiers fainted, dropping his rifle from his hands. On the 6th floor, Vorontsov looked at the body again and noticed that the boy with empty eyes was still smiling. Object 17 was deeply hidden in the snow-covered hills. The concrete building went underground, and the heavy steel gates were guarded by machine gunners in black greatcoats. It wasn't a camp, it wasn't a prison complex, but everything here smelled of secrecy and death. No one talked too much, did not ask why they had arrived, did not check the lists. The officer at the checkpoint only looked at the papers and ordered the gate to be opened. When the children were taken out of the trucks, none of them wrapped themselves in clothes. They walked without fear of the cold, without looking around, without trying to get closer to each other. Vorontsov signed the documents at the doctor on duty, handing over the lists. "Everything is in place," he said, and the doctor just nodded silently, not asking a single question. The captain was about to leave, but he felt someone's gaze. He turned around. Anna, a girl with cold blue eyes, was looking at him. Her lips moved slightly. "You shouldn't have brought us," she whispered. He felt a chill unrelated to the weather. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but the girl had already turned away. The doors of the complex slammed shut, and somewhere in its depths, something was coming to life. The complex went deep underground. The further Vorontsov followed the officer accompanying him, the heavier the air became, saturated with the smell of concrete, dampness, and iron. The lighting here was poor. Dim lamps barely gave off light, flooding the corridors with yellowish spots. The walls were smooth, without the usual signs of long-term use, but at the same time they somewhat resembled barracks. However, there was no fuss. There were no voices, no footsteps, and not a single sound, except for the occasional creak of doors and the rustle of paper as the officer leading Vorontsov flipped through documents in his hands. "Object 17 was founded before the war, Comrade Captain," he said slowly, as if choosing his words. "Initially, it was a research laboratory that studied borderline mental states. But after the 41st year, when the war became protracted, our leadership decided to reconsider its goals. You do understand that we need not only weapons, but also new methods of warfare, don't you?" Vorontsov did not answer, continuing to study the corridors. It was too clean in here. It's too quiet.
"You are to accompany the facility until the tests are completed," the officer continued. "At the moment, the subjects are divided into cells."
Vorontsov felt a vague uneasiness growing inside him. Unlike ordinary prison cells, there were no bars in these rooms. Instead, there are smooth metal doors with small peepholes for observation. There was nothing inside except metal bunks and devices for recording the condition of the test subjects. Everything has been thought out here. There was nothing superfluous here. He stopped at one of the doors and peered through the peephole. Stepan was sitting motionless on the edge of the cot inside. The boy with the blank stare. He didn't even turn his head, but Vorontsov sensed that he knew he was being watched. The captain looked down at the dossier. Deaf and dumb. Orphan. It was found in a ruined village near Orel, the only survivor of the German purge. At the children's camp where he was later sent, 12 guards died in a few nights. No signs of violence, for no apparent reason. The doctors found nothing but one thing: Everyone had dilated pupils, as if in the last seconds of their lives they had seen something so terrible that their bodies could not stand it. "Comrade Captain," a voice said from behind him, and Vorontsov slowly turned around. In front of him stood a tall man in a white coat with sharp features. "Do you want to attend the first tests?" "What kind of tests?" "Basic," the doctor replied with an almost imperceptible smile. "Assessment of stress tolerance, reactions to stimuli. After that, the first series of experiments will begin." The experimental room resembled an interrogation room. Concrete walls, a table, a dim lamp under the ceiling. Through the opaque glass that hid the observers, Vorontsov could see the entire situation. A male prisoner in shabby clothes, with sunken cheeks and a swollen face, was led into the left part of the room. Shackled, he looked half dead, but there was still hatred in his eyes. He jerked when they sat him down on a chair, trying to escape, but the guards roughly sat him back down. The second door opened and Anna was led inside. The girl slowly entered the room, not looking at the prisoner. She didn't look around, didn't blink, didn't show the slightest interest in what was happening. She just stood there. "Here we go," said a voice behind him. The prisoner jerked again, his body tensed, but then froze. At first, Vorontsov did not understand what had happened. It seemed that the man was still breathing, but then he noticed that his chest was no longer rising. The prisoner tried to breathe, but could not. His eyes widened, and an unspoken curse froze on his lips. He began to choke. His chest was convulsing, and his pupils were so dilated that the iris was almost gone. He made a small, strangled sound, not a scream, not a moan, but something else, unnatural. And then he just fell down. "Cardiac arrest," the doctor stated calmly, watching the sensors. "The second stage." Vorontsov opened his mouth to say something, but at that moment the prisoner's body arched and black foam gushed out of his mouth. He was dead, but his body was still twitching. "Wrong reaction," the doctor said unhappily, nodding at the guard. Without further ado, he pulled out a pistol and shot the prisoner in the head. After that, the body finally went limp. Anna turned her head. She wasn't smiling, but Vorontsov knew she could see them. She knows she's being watched. The captain took a step back, feeling some primal feeling growing inside, unfamiliar to him before. Fear. These children are not just test subjects. They are not children. They are something completely different. Vorontsov could not sleep. There was an oppressive silence in the room assigned to him in the complex, broken only by the hollow echo of ventilation. Lying on his bunk, he stared at the ceiling, trying to get the experiment out of his head. The picture still stood before his eyes, the prisoner, frozen in place. His wild gaze, his convulsions. Anna, who just looked at him and did nothing. But it was enough for the man to die. Faint footsteps could be heard through the walls. It was like someone small was walking down the hallway. But this is impossible. The children were locked in their cells after the ordeal. He sat up in bed and looked at the door. No one. Getting up, he slowly approached, opened it, and looked out. The hallway was empty. The lights from the ceiling flickered, casting long shadows, but there was nothing suspicious. Just an eerie, icy silence. But he knew that someone was there. He didn't like this complex. Too quiet. Too clean. Too not alive. After rubbing his face, he closed the door and went back to bed. Tomorrow was a new day. A new experiment. But before he fell asleep, he heard someone laughing softly in the corner of the room. The next morning in the mess hall, he noticed that the officers looked just like him, badly sleeping, pale, with distant looks. They ate in silence, lost in thought. "Did you hear that last night?" One of them, a young lieutenant with thin lips, suddenly asked. "What is it?" Vorontsov asked quietly. The children were walking along the corridors. Several people looked up. Someone silently shook his head. Someone looked down. "Have you checked?" another officer asked. I checked. Everything is in place in the cells. The silence became heavy and sticky. Vorontsov put the spoon on the tray. "These are not children." The young lieutenant swallowed nervously. The second series of experiments was conducted in a dark room. The children were sitting on chairs in a circle, in the center of which a prisoner was tied up. Doctors recorded the indicators. Vorontsov stood aside, watching as one of the scientists approached each of the children and gave them a simple command. "Look." When it came to Stepan's turn, the boy did nothing. He just lowered his head. The prisoner groaned. Vorontsov tensed as he saw beads of sweat trickle down the man's face and his breathing quicken. "Stop it," one of the doctors ordered. Stepan raised his head. The prisoner screamed. He screamed like he was being burned alive. His body convulsed, his arms twitched, and blood gushed from his nose and ears. The next moment, he lay still like a doll, dropping his head on his chest. He had a smile on his face. Stepan looked directly at Vorontsov. That night, one of the doctors committed suicide. They found him sitting against the wall in his office, his mouth wide open, as if he wanted to say something before he died. His eyes were filled with horror. Vorontsov saw the dead. I've seen hundreds killed, but this one was different. Someone had scratched the words, "They are not children," on the wall behind him. He stared at those words for a very long time. Then he turned around and went to the cells. Stepan was waiting for him, smiling. Vorontsov walked slowly down the corridor, listening to the dull silence of the complex. The air here was still, stagnant, as if no one had breathed for a long time. The overhead lights blinked, casting long shadows on the walls that disappeared too quickly, as if someone invisible was moving beyond his perception. In the depths of his subconscious, there was a feeling that he was not alone here, although there were no footsteps except his own. He knew that fear. I felt it in reconnaissance, when I had to go into the night, in complete silence, knowing that the enemy could be anywhere. But there was no enemy here. There were no rifles, no concealed firing points, and no ambushes. There were only children here. He knew it was a lie. They weren't children. It was brighter in the laboratory than in the corridors. Several doctors in white coats were arranging papers on tables, checking instruments, and preparing for new tests. Vorontsov entered without saying a word. He didn't have to ask what exactly they were going to do today. He already knew. They were going to test the subject's influence on the captives again. What happened to Stepan yesterday didn't stop them. Anna was sitting in the center of the room. Her small hands rested on her lap, and her blonde hair was neatly combed back. His face remained blank, without emotion, as if in front of the doctors there was not a child, but a doll planted for a demonstration experiment. Vorontsov looked at her, waiting for at least some kind of display of emotion, but she ignored him. She just sat there, breathing calmly, as if everything that was happening around her had nothing to do with her. The prisoner was brought in later. It was another prisoner of war, but this time not a German, a Soviet soldier. His dirty tunic was torn, his hair was matted, and there was dried blood at the corners of his lips. Vorontsov did not know why he was brought here, but he guessed. A deserter? A defector? Or just unwanted? No questions were asked here. The people who entered this complex no longer existed for the outside world. Anna slowly raised her head and looked at the prisoner. "Let's get started," the doctor said quietly. Vorontsov tensed up. He saw the man raise his head and look at the girl. There was bewilderment in his eyes at first, then anger, then something else. His forehead wrinkled and his breathing became labored. He exhaled sharply, as if he had lost control of his own body. His arms twitched, his shoulders tensed. "What the hell?" one of the doctors muttered. The prisoner groaned. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his neck arched like a puppet touched by the puppeteer's hand. He started shaking. Blood began to flow from his nose. "Stop it!" Vorontsov snapped, but no one moved. The prisoner jerked as if something had broken inside. His lips parted, but no sound came out of his mouth. Then he just sat down on the floor. Anna did not move. "The reaction time has decreased," the doctor said with satisfaction. Vorontsov felt something snap inside him. "This is not progress," he said softly. "It's murder." The doctor did not answer. "I just made a note in the magazine." Vorontsov went out first. He could feel eyes on him without even turning around. He didn't need to see who was watching. He knew. He didn't sleep that night. He could hear someone walking through the corridors again. When he came out, the hallway was empty, but in the distance, right next to the wall, in the place where a few hours ago the smooth plaster had hung, now the words were dark, scratched out with sharp nails. "They're hungry. They need new ones." The letters were small, but they were written by a child's hand. Vorontsov walked along the corridor, feeling the cold seep under his greatcoat, although there were no drafts in the complex. It was a different cold, not physical, but some kind of internal, sticky, creeping along the spine. It's always been quiet here, too quiet, but now that silence has taken on a different tone. It was as if something was hiding behind the walls, waiting, not showing itself, but letting you know that it was there. He could hear the faintest whisper. It was as if someone small was standing in the dark and repeating the same words. He strained his ears, trying to make it out, but with every step the whisper receded, disappearing, leaving behind only a sense of wrongness. The doctors no longer looked into his eyes. After the last experiment, after another prisoner simply collapsed to the floor without uttering a cry or a groan, even those who had previously treated the trials with cold professionalism began to behave differently. They became quieter. Their movements lost their clarity. And something appeared in their gaze that he had seen in soldiers on the front line. They began to realize that they were not dealing with something controlled, not with objects of research, but with something much more than they were able to understand. Anna was sitting in her cell, motionless as always. Her eyes stared straight ahead, but when Vorontsov approached, she slowly turned her head and looked at him. He didn't know which would be scarier, if she smiled or if she remained indifferent, as before. "They're coming for you," she said softly. His fingers involuntarily clenched into a fist. "Who?" Anna blinked, but didn't answer. When he went out into the corridor, something hit the air with force. A sharp, oppressive jolt that was not a sound, was not a vibration, but was something that penetrated to the very depths of consciousness. Vorontsov clutched his head, trying to figure out what was happening, and saw one of the doctors run out of a nearby laboratory, his face deathly pale, his eyes wide, and his hands shaking. He was panting as if he had just run several kilometers. But there were no sweat marks on his body. His lips were moving soundlessly, and blood was trickling from his ears. "They're not human," he whispered, and fell. His body twitched once or twice more, after which he froze, and his eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling with a crazy, empty stare. Vorontsov did not immediately realize that this was not the end. The second doctor came out of the laboratory. His face seemed unnaturally tense, his lips were trembling, and his pupils were dilated so that the irises almost disappeared. He wasn't walking. He was swimming, as if his feet were no longer touching the floor. "They're hungry," he whispered. "They're hungry, they're hungry, they're hungry." And suddenly, before Vorontsov could react, the doctor grabbed his head and began to scratch the skin, tearing off pieces of meat with his nails until his fingers rested on the bone. Vorontsov stepped back, feeling nausea rising from the depths of his stomach. One of the guards rushed forward, grabbed the doctor by the arms, but he no longer resisted. He collapsed to the floor, his fingers still moving convulsively, and there was something in his eyes that made Vorontsov feel really cold. He had seen that expression before. That's how the dead looked. The entire complex was no longer just a place of research. He became something else. Something alive. At night, Vorontsov bolted the door and sat on his bunk, holding a pistol at the ready. He could hear something scratching the walls. It was as if small fingers were tracing the concrete, leaving footprints that no one would see. He knew he couldn't fall asleep. But he also knew something else. It doesn't matter if you're awake or asleep. They'll find you here anyway. Vorontsov was sitting on his bunk, clutching a pistol in his hand, but the weapon seemed useless, as if there was no defense against what was happening here. He didn't know how much time had passed, maybe an hour, maybe several. The room was quiet, but outside the walls of the complex, the silence became vivid. She was shrinking, throbbing, breathing. He could hear footsteps in the corridors, light, childish, but there was nothing childish about it. The footsteps did not stop, did not slow down, did not hurry. They moved with the kind of mechanical precision he had heard from prisoners who were being led to the firing squad. No one was knocking on his door. No one tried to open it. But he knew he was being heard. Something out there beyond the walls knew that he was here, that he wasn't sleeping, that he was sitting in the dark, clutching a weapon, unable to move. He could have sworn that at some point he heard a soft laugh, but maybe it was just a buzzing in his ears. He didn't notice how he fell asleep. When he opened his eyes, something had changed in the room. The ventilation stopped making noise. There was not the slightest movement of air. The lamp in the ceiling was burning steadily, but its light seemed too dim. Vorontsov got up cautiously, feeling something heavy, sticky, and alien being squeezed inside. He took a step towards the door and stopped. Someone was standing in the corner of the room. My heart jumped, but my hand with the gun remained motionless. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The shadow in the corner was motionless, but he could see that it was there. He couldn't hear breathing. I didn't hear the rustle of clothes, but the feeling of presence was so strong that the air in his lungs became viscous. "Who are you?" "What is it?" he asked softly. The shadow did not answer. He didn't know how much time had passed as he stood staring into the darkness. Maybe seconds, maybe hours. But when he finally blinked, the shadow was gone. The door was open. The hallway in front of him was empty. The lamps blinked, casting a wavering light. Vorontsov came out, holding the pistol in front of him, and headed for the laboratory. Everything that was happening here, all the experiments, all the notes, all the recorded data. He needed to know exactly what was being investigated in this damn place. He was going down to where the archives were located. No guards. Not a single person. It's like all the staff just disappeared. He found the door where the reports were kept. The documents were arranged in neat folders, but he didn't need to organize them. He grabbed the first one he saw and started reading. The first record was dated 1937, Routine Psychological Tests on Children with Abnormal Features. The second was in 1938, Attempts to Control the Manifestations of Mental Abilities. The third is 1940, the first cases of losses among researchers. Then, 1941, 1942, 1943. Every year the reports became shorter and more stingy. The mentions of losses were gone, but he knew they were there. And then, at the very end, an entry dated autumn 1944. Facility 17 has reached the stage of full autonomy. Control is impossible. The sample of subjects continues. Vorontsov's. Hand tightened on the edge of the leaf. He turned the page, but there was nothing further. His fingers slowly released the paper. "They're hungry," a voice said from behind him. He turned around, but there was no one in the room. He had to leave. He left the archive room and hurried up the stairs, but the higher he climbed, the stronger the feeling became that someone was following him. He did not hear footsteps, did not feel the movement of the air, but he knew that there was something behind him, just a few steps away. He almost ran, reaching the laboratory level, where he finally saw people. They were standing along the walls. The guards, doctors, officers, None of them moved. Their eyes were open, their bodies remained straight, but they were not breathing. Their faces were blank, like dolls that had been left without threads.
"Captain!"
said a voice. Vorontsov slowly turned his head. Anna was standing in the center of the hallway. She wasn't smiling, but he saw that she knew. "You brought us," she said.
He didn't move, didn't blink.
"You're staying with us now." Something moved behind him. The air thickened, shimmered. He raised his gun. Anna looked at him curiously.
It won't help.
Vorontsov knew she was right. He took a step back, and the darkness closed in.